This trend is something that's been popular on social media for quite a while now. Back during OG YouTube, you had guys like Elliot Hulse. Nowadays, you have guys like Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan, Andrew Tate, who come out there and they give advice to young men and they tell young men what they should do and what they shouldn't do and how to be a man, even if it's something as simple as you should clean up your room, as Jordan Peterson recommends. And it begs the question, how is this happening? Why do we keep letting them get away with it? How do these dudes keep getting so much clout? And the reason why this is happening is twofold. The first reason is because times change now faster than they've ever changed before. The internet and technology have created a society where change happens so quickly that the practical advice that your dad can give you is so limited because his life, his upbringing is so different than the sort of situation and the sort of environment that young men are dealing with today. Back in the day in medieval times, when you had a blacksmith and he had a son, that son's life was going to be more or less the same as the blacksmith. And if he had a grandson and a great grandson, their lives were going to be similar as well. That is no longer the case. So that's the first reason. Now, the second reason is simply due to the fact that in the West, there is a lot more fatherlessness. There is a lot more single motherhood. And so if you have a dad, it's hard to know what to do because times just change so quickly and the environment is so uncertain. And if you don't, it's even harder, right? And so that begs the question, is this even a problem? There's clearly a need for some guidance. There's clearly a need for some mentorship, for some fatherhood. So these guys are kind of filling the hole. What's the problem here? And while I do think that a lot of these guys often do give good advice, there are some problems that could arise from this sort of trend. And to kind of talk about this more, I want to reach back into classical antiquity and talk about the ancient Greeks. There was a philosopher named Socrates, and Socrates noticed that there were two types of speakers: people who spoke in rhetoric and people who spoke in dialectic. Now, Socrates described people who spoke in rhetoric as people who were typically charismatic. They are tall and handsome, and they had a smooth way of talking, and they were really good at riling up people's emotions and getting people excited and telling people what they wanted to hear and saying what they needed to say to get clout for themselves. This was all the way back in ancient Greek times. Meanwhile, there were people who spoke in dialectic. Dialectic people were a bit more quiet. They were a bit more nerdy. They weren't as showy. And they would engage in debate, but not the sort of debate where you're making fun of each other. Rather, it's more quiet debate. And, people are thinking about things and changing their mind. And so what Socrates concluded was it was the people who spoke in dialectic who were truly seeking the truth and getting down to the brass tacks of things, getting the real answers, the deep answers to things. And it was the people who spoke in rhetoric that were doing so to kind of play off the audience. They were almost entertainers. And so this is the sort of problem that you can run into with being a successful internet father on the internet, where for you to even become successful, you need to be considering things like your entertainment value. You need to be considering things like, what do the people want to hear? Because people generally do not watch content that they do not want to watch and hear what they want to hear. That's just what happens. And so you have all of these incentives for these internet fathers, these internet gurus, to kind of present their message in such a way, even if it's a good message, even if there's some good content in it, they'll have to present it in such a way where it might be watered down, or it might be something that is something that people want to hear, and they might shy away from saying things that people might not want to hear, but are actually really beneficial for them. And this is a problem that you also notice in modern books versus old books. If you read any books that were written in the past decade or so, you'll often find this trend where the books have a lot of fluff and fancy writing and a lot of anecdotes. Let's say it's a self-help book. And there are a few concepts in that book, but there's so much padding around those concepts that the book really just could have been a couple pages long. But they don't make it a couple pages long. It needs to be a full book so you can sell it, so you can make money, so you can kind of work on your brand and make your brand better. Books nowadays are a tool of a lot of businessmen to further their business desires. Whereas back in the day, back in the day, hundreds of years ago, there was no business incentive to write books. The literal reason, the only reason you would write a book is to pass on knowledge from one generation into another. And so that's why you will find that a lot of older books, while being a bit more dry, while being a bit more dense, while being a bit more boring, will tend to have, that sort of clear, crystallized, uncompromising messaging compared to the new books that have a lot more fluff and rhetoric and emotional appeal, and maybe it has a pretty cover, and maybe it has a flashy title. Back in the day, they had no need to clickbait with their titles. They would literally name their books like whatever the subject is, like On the Incarnation or On Metaphysics or Critique of Pure Reason, like very straight to the point. But that is not the case with how the internet works if you're going to be a popular YouTuber. So this creates a dilemma. And that dilemma is, if you remember at the beginning of the video, I mentioned that times are changing now faster than ever. And so books written 200 years ago, information from 300 years ago, is not always going to be up to date. For example, you can't really learn programming from a book from 300 years ago. You're going to need to engage in some of the newer content. And so what do? It's tricky. It's hard to go out and figure out kind of how to be efficient with your time and how to extract information without wasting as much time as you can, getting as much information in the smallest amount of time as possible. There's no easy answers to the solution, trying to find the noise in the signal, but that's what needs to be done. Also, kind of in defense of the older books, they're not as out of date as you might think. And the reason why that is if you take the example of programming again, there is programming and then there is computer science. So what's the difference between these two things? Programming is something that you do. It's something that you implement and you write it in a certain language. Maybe it's JavaScript, maybe it's Python, maybe it's C++. And these languages, these specific technologies are constantly changing all of the time. So you're always needing to stay up to date, but the fundamentals, that is the theory, that is the abstractions, that is the baseline stuff, the base concepts, those don't really change over time in much in the same way the specific technologies do. Another example might be something like architecture. The mathematics, the geometry behind architecture are things that have been consistent for millennia since we've discovered them. Now, the specifics in how you build the house or the specifics of how you plan the design of the house might change drastically over time, but the fundamental stuff does not. The math doesn't change. And so a lot of these books do focus on those fundamentals and are timeless for that reason. And to focus on those is going to give people an advantage. It's going to give you an advantage over someone who's constantly chasing trends and constantly trying to swap out one piece of information for another and constantly being overfed with news. And I kind of want to wrap up with this quote from Will Durant, one of the greatest historians of all time. He says that we are suffocated of news and we are starved of history.